Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Homeschool Minnesota. My name is Dayle Annand. I'm your host for today. As always, we just want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to be here with us. This podcast is an outreach ministry of MÂCHÉ, Minnesota Association of Christian Home Educators. I'm really excited today. I get to talk to a lot of people, and sometimes, I just get to have people on who it fascinates me what they do and who they are. And we've had this person on, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, last year when he talked about his book, Traced, and his video series and everything that goes along with that. And what it did was it traced back our DNA back to the time of Noah. Correct, Dr. Jeanson?
That's correct.
Yes,
Yes.
that's right. Okay, I want to make sure got that right. And he works with Answers in Genesis, and he's here to talk about it's groundbreaking new book. There's some great stuff in here, and it's called, this is the book right here, They Had Names. And I just want to welcome Dr. Jeanson today. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me on, Dayle, and thanks for your patience as I had to cancel our first appointment. We had a sudden wedding in my family, and so
Well,
went up to
family
Wisconsin
comes
and back.
first. Family comes first. We can always do a podcast. Can't reschedule a wedding, so we're good.
Thank you.
I'm just excited because I've had you on before. We talked about Traced and how your work in DNA can trace human history all the way back to Genesis 10, or the descendants of Noah. This book discusses the history more specifically of the Native Americans, of the Americas, North and South America, and the Native people who settled here. And in this area, you have said, I have always known that there was something off about the history of North America. And I just thought that was an interesting quote. And I'd like you to just kind of expound on that. What did you mean by that when you said it?
I'd say there's two elements to that. There's the academic sort of history class side of it, and then there's just my personal experience side. Last history class I took was in high school, but world history, we called it, I've learned is basically history of Western civilization. There's a very detailed history we were taught for Europe, where a lot of this happens. I mean, it goes back to Sumer, ancient Greeks, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, but then you get to the Romans, and of course, going forward in time to the Middle Ages, or the Vikings before them in the Middle Ages, I guess the early Middle Ages, and then anyway, Renaissance, Reformation. I was in a Christian school, so all that sits with you or with me, and names and places and dates, and then you go to the Americas, and it's basically, here's the history after Columbus or after the Pilgrims, which again, there's plenty of people and names, and here's the president, and we went through, I mean, that's getting to some of U.S. history, but there was this glaring absence of information on the pre-European Americas, and it's not because somehow I was denied some sort of rightful history, as much as nobody's known it. And so I grew up knowing there's some sort of gap there. Why aren't we learning about this? And then the second element, my mother's German, and so going to Germany regularly growing up, it's hard to turn around in Europe and not bump into some sort of old, ancient cathedral or ruin, and it's just taken for granted. Oh, that's from the Middle Ages. That's from 1,000 years ago. That's from 2,000 years ago. And you come here, and we would see touristy things, U.S. history stuff. We've been to Plymouth Plantation, but there was this, where are the ruins? If there's a long history here, which surely there must be, there was this, again, contrast between what I knew from Europe and then coming back here and, well, what is it? What is the explanation? I had nothing to go on. There was just kind of this big blank slate in which nothing was written, couldn't put anything on a map. Yes, we learned the map of here were the cultures at contact, but again, that's very late timestamp in history, and had nothing to fill in the gap between, well, I guess someone must have come over after Babel, but no idea what happened between then and then here come the Pilgrims. So that was the nagging question for me for many decades until recently.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting because that was something that I always wondered about as a child. I was saying to you how I always, living in Minnesota, we have a lot of native tribes and a lot of reservation land in our state. And as a child, I often wondered, why does it always felt like they didn't fit, which is weird because, I mean, of course they do. They were here long before we were. And the land I lived on was their land, long before I got here and my ancestors got here. And I just wondered, why is it that they just don't feel like they fit? And I think about now, when we talked about Traced, one thing that you had said is that they don't have, Native Americans and Pre-Columbian, they just don't have a lot of ideas of their history. Like there's no real confirmation of it because it's an oral history mostly. And I remember thinking about that and thinking maybe that's why, they just didn't. I mean, we could start at 1492 and then go from there. And we had, a lot of written down and a lot of artifacts and things like that. But it was hard to trace. And so I wondered, about that. And then you came out with They've Got Names. They had names. And I'm going to tell everybody this. First of all, this is a great history book for high school students. Like for real, your high school students should read this. They really should. And I just think that that's just an important part of who we are. But also in the middle of the book, there is like a good 40 pages or more of just great, like, I'm going to show you a little bit, just maps and things that have to do with this era of history. And it's just, I was telling Dr. Jeanson that I spent a lot of time in those maps while I was looking at this book because it's just fascinating to me how you were able to trace all of this using the DNA. Um, First of all, were you surprised by any of your findings?
I'd say just being able to reconstruct a play-by-play, and the book is part travelogue. So the two
Yeah.
mysteries I had at the beginning, I guess I'm trying to then solve in the book of where are the ruins. I visit them. I talk about my time there, what I learned from each of them. There's still places to go and visit where you can see the stories, basically,
Yeah.
of what transpired here, and then also reconstructing the who was here, what are their names, can we connect tribes to archaeological ruins? The mainstream community largely cannot, but we can now. So just being able to see it emerge, I don't think I ever had that on my radar when I started as a professional creationist 15 years ago. Not on my radar at all of let's go solve what happened in the Americas before Columbus, but here we are. And it's in a sense a product of following the data where it leads. And the ultimate hero of the story, I would say, is the young Earth timescale. So it's not just a generic creationist worldview that has allowed these discoveries to be made. It's a specifically grounded in the young Earth time frame, 4,500 years back to Noah, that's allowed the connections between genetics and indigenous histories and archaeology and linguistics to all together then give us this play-by-play. So I guess that's one surprise is just the fact of being able to recover something when there was nothing, again, in
Yeah.
my own mind 10, 15 years ago. And then secondly, I'd say is just to see the sheer dynamism of what it was like here. I guess we probably all grew up with the mainstream view of 15,000 years ago being one migration and then isolation for 14,500 years. So
Mhm.
even if you say, well, let's kind of try to convert that to a young Earth time frame, there's still this, well, we kind of grew up with, they were isolated, right? There was no contact until Columbus, right? And so to see, no, genetically, in the book I go through at least 3 migrations from old world into new. This is ongoing research, so I can say July of this year, this came out in May, July I made another discovery of 2 more migrations. So there's at least 5 migrations
Wow.
after Babel from the old world into the new. And just to see that the continuous linkage between these two places, hemispheres, is really fascinating and adds a whole new color to the mental map and to how we conceive of history as happening here before Europeans.
And where did they originate from, the Native Americans? Like and when we're talking Native Americans, we're talking the Americas, Canada through South America, like not just the United States, although you focus quite a bit on the United States because that's, where you're from and that's who we are. But you do spend quite a bit of time talking about like even the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Incas and all the different native tribes that are around. So where did you find that they originated from?
So for these 5 migrations, the first one we have no genetic linkage to yet,
Okay.
but that would be, I think, in terms of archaeological echoes, Mesoamerica, Central America would be the best place to go look. There just isn't that much here
Oh.
3,000 years ago in North America. And it's the Olmecs, the builder of the giant sculpted heads down in the Gulf Coast of Mexico, that are the premier example of this. They seem to have disappeared. We don't have their genetic lineage, but from 1000 BC onward, then we do have genetic lineages. And so 1000 BC, 100 BC, about 400 AD, 900 AD, all these are migrations. And they all seem to come from basically the same spot, which is central, Northeast, East Asia, which I think explains readily then why Native Americans have this sort of East Asian physical appearance,
Yeah.
whether genetically linked to relatives of the Chinese or relatives of those tribes that were north of them. Xiongnu would be one specific group, not very well known, but if you study Chinese history, they're fairly famous around the time of Christ or right before it in terms of harassing the Chinese. So there's Huns who are from Central Asia. They migrated into the Roman Empire as it was falling. their relatives also came across. Anyway, so that's the main hub of people coming this way, which kind of makes sense. Central Asia is probably as a secondary consequence of its land not being terribly conducive to agriculture. The Chinese were sedentary and had the Yellow River, uh, Yangtze River, others that allowed for fertility of the soil and for people to be sedentary growing crops. Central Asia is much more conducive to pastoral lifestyles, sheep, livestock, and so forth. And if you've got a pastoral lifestyle, you're going to be on the move all the time. And so I think that readily explains why that would be a place then you just kind of keep moving, keep
Yeah.
going east, essentially, and you're in the Americas. So I think that also explains the tremendous adaptability of the people here,
Yeah.
because multiple migrations and you've got people thriving from the Arctic to the Amazon, and those are dramatically different environments, yet the Native Americans found ways to thrive in them,
Yeah.
and all the way up into the point of contact. So that's the main source, and it connects a lot of dots once you have that link in hand.
And how is this book, the knowledge of the information in this book, how does it rewrite what we've known about American history so far?
That's a good question. I think of two things. There's a rewriting of the evolutionary narrative,
Yeah.
but even in that sense, I feel like there's a limit to my statement because there just isn't much there when you go to evolution. Yes, they have that migration 15,000 years ago, rapid dispersal, but evolutionary history is basically then hunters and gatherers for 10,000 years or so, then the first civilization about 1600 BC with the Olmecs. But in terms of North America, you won't find a play-by-play. They're quite stuck in the archaeological realm using archaeological labels, the Mississippian culture, Poverty Point culture, stuff that doesn't connect to the tribes we learn about at contact, like the Lakota and the Potawatomi and the Illinois and the
Yeah.
Sauk and the Shawnee and so forth. They're very reticent to do so, and the reason is they just don't have the tools to do it. They're ultimately it's the time scale that doesn't allow them to link genetics with specific tribes. What I'm able to show in the book is with genetics linking up to indigenous histories, I can connect specific branches of the family tree to specific tribes. There's events that emerge. We can link them up with archaeology and say, okay, no, this site that was built by the Natchez. The Natchez, whose capital was here, had a great battle about late 1300s, and they fought the ancestors of the Delaware, who were allied with the ancestors of the Sioux, and so on. That's the type of thing that's emerged from all this. That's a dramatic rewrite. Well, I said it's a limited statement. It's a rewrite of what the evolutionists say, but I feel like an even bigger element is it's just writing for the first time. It's filling in the blank
Yeah.
of where there's been nothing. That's what I grew up with. And I
Yeah.
should maybe add even the third term. It's recovering, because a lot of the key history here is from the Native Americans themselves, and they've had it. It's just been dismissed. And so it's
Yeah.
returning to them their own histories and dignity and value along with it. And the benefit to the rest of us is to know exactly what transpired and where and why.
So the interesting thing, I think, like you just said, is it's returning their history to them and validating it. Um, Remind us again why that needed to happen. What was it about their history that just kind of people just brushed it off?
I'd say that the prevailing attitude among the mainstream community, the evolutionary community, is to be dismissive of the indigenous accounts. There's been a bit of a shift, I'd say.
Mhm.
There's postmodernism infecting mainstream science as well, where there's almost a duality of we're going to affirm these mutually exclusive or contradictory ideas of evolution says they'll reach some conclusion. The indigenous accounts say something else. So many indigenous accounts, and this is something I learned in the last few years, hold as a matter of religious doctrine, not
Mhm.
just political convenience, that they've always been here. And that, of course, contradicts evolution with this migration in the distant past from Asia. And there's this, again, for lack of a better term, this postmodern attempt to say, yeah, they're all true. Any person going through the logic will say, no, I'm sorry, at least one of them must be wrong.
Yeah.
So you can't have that. And maybe that's an attempt to hold on to or try not to completely dismiss what they're saying, because there's obviously, it's kind of insulting if you tell them, we don't
Yeah.
believe what you said and it's not valuable and we can't trust it. And yes, there's an academic background to it where, again, it makes sense you're going to go to sources or put more value on sources that are written down, because
Right.
things can be influenced and twisted and turned. But what's remarkable to me is you have some of these histories which claim to be written down, some that are oral, but they line up with genetics.
Yeah.
In this way, then, trees that evolutionists have taken away, in the sense of they say, we're not even going to listen to you and we're going to reconstruct a history without input from what the tribes themselves have said. Now we come along and say, no, genetics is confirming what you're saying, and so your ancestors weren't dumb. They knew what they were doing, and they accurately preserved exactly what happened. And we're relying on this then to reconstruct the history. That is a form, I think, of returning dignity and value, and in terms of practical consequences. I've seen the Native Americans reach out of their own accord and say, could you help with us reconstructing our own histories? The premier example of this would be the Lakota, end of 2023. They're a very traditional group, very proud of being traditional, take pot shots at other groups like the Navajos, saying, they've got a Western government, we're not assimilated like they are.
Yeah.
Anti-Christian as well.
Yeah.
Yet they invited me to come speak on DNA and Indigenous histories, even though normally we'd have nothing to do with each other, because I think they recognize this is one of the only frameworks that does affirm what they say. And the Lakota have a very detailed migration account, they and their ancestors and other related tribes linguistically,
Yeah.
saying ultimately they came from the East Coast. Well, I should say they said they came from the North, and the first timestamp we can put on it is about the 800s, 800 AD,
Wow.
near where Washington, D.C. is, and then migrated westward. I can put them, I think, in Wisconsin by about the 1200s. The Osage and their more immediate relatives, like the Omaha and Ponca, separated at the mouth of the Ohio at the Mississippi. They say about the 1300s or late 1300s. So there's a lot of detail that I think genetics will confirm within when you have the young Earth timescale, and that was the topic of conversation. So it's opening doors I didn't expect to be opened, and because of the success we're seeing and the agreement between genetics and Indigenous histories.
Wow. And so what has been the reaction from the scientific community and then again the Native community? Like what has, you can read the accounts of the Native in your book at the beginning. I just got choked up reading it like, oh, this is such a God thing, how God is just giving them his vision for who they are. But talk a little bit about like the response that you've received from both communities.
In terms of Native Americans, we've got contacts now in about 30 plus tribes. Most of the people who've contacted me, I think, would be professing Christians, not all of them though. And of course, the Lakota would be the highest example where it's actually tribal leadership reaching out and saying, could you come and then speak in front of us? In terms of the mainstream community, I'd say that their practice that they've had for quite some time is ongoing. Namely, they try to marginalize us. And so just to put that in historical context, in the 1970s, so I was born in 1980, and this is history I've had to read about and learn about, and have discovered there was a world that no longer exists. The 1970s were the real heyday of creation science, debates on college campuses, laundry list of college campuses. I've got in my office here a book from the Institute for Creation Research. I think it's a 1976 bound book of, here's all our monthly publications, but wrapped in one spot. So they're reporting on 1975 activities, and the amount of colleges they're listing all across the map, Berkeley and UNC and places
Wow.
we never get into now.
No.
That's the successes they were having. Doors were being opened. They were getting creation science to the public schools. All that's basically been shut down. The school side with as a result of court decisions in the 1980s, and the debates going away because the evolutionists themselves made a conscious decision to do so. I think it was Stephen Jay Gould who said, look, to his fellow evolutionists, look, the best we can do is a tie. A tie doesn't help evolution. And for crying out loud, we're platforming these creationists. So just please stop. So when Bill Nye debated Ken Ham, he got a lot of flack from his fellow evolutionists because that strategy is still in place. Please stop giving the creationists a platform. And so they've been very successful. So I have the statistics now. I just found these out last year. The number of students who go through universities that teach only evolution is 99%. Or I should say the percentage.
Wow.
The exact number is, I think in 2021, there are 15 million undergraduate students in the United States, and 99% of them are going to hear only evolution at the college level. So the evolutionists have achieved a suffocating monopoly on this, very successful. And so it's in their interest to keep it that way. And so one of the ways is to not give any creationists a platform, not even acknowledge that things are being done, in hopes that no one will notice. I think the democratization of media has changed that. Twitter or X allows people to have a voice. YouTube, so we haven't gotten banned yet, but YouTube, we've seen a large audience, some videos going viral. People contact me saying, I don't agree with that Bible stuff, but I think you're onto something. And so I think it's breaking through some of the walls the gatekeepers have set up. And so that the mainstream professional community, again, has still tried to basically ignore this. But with this outreach we're doing publicly, where there's no cost and that sort of thing, I think we're getting into places and reaching people that we've not normally been able to reach. And my hope is this only grows. And I think the reason is just to kind of reflect on this briefly. The research we're doing is consciously directed and angled towards the court decisions of the 1980s. They said,
Yeah.
in technical terms, we have to make testable predictions. A good analogy for this would be they said, we can't just do lawyer work where we cross-examine what they say. We have to do detective work. Go find a question and solve it. That's what this work represents. And one of the secondary benefits of this is when you make testable predictions, when you do detective work, you solve a case, you make discoveries. Discoveries make news, and news gets people's attention. Unless there's, of course, someone keeping you from saying that. So that's I think what's going on, and I don't see how the evolutionary community can stop that because, again, yes, what we're doing is rewriting history, but it's also just filling in a big blank. And I think the reason the videos go viral is because it's scratching an itch no one else has been able to do. It's
Yeah.
only the scriptural framework that connects these dots, that comes up with answers. And I think even those who don't normally follow us are saying there's something working here. You're finding something that no one else is, and they're sitting up and listening. And that's a real opportunity to make progress in the wider culture, I think, that we haven't had before.
Yeah. I think that it's interesting to me. You graduated from Harvard with your PhD, and you are very well educated, and you've been in, but all your schools have been secular schools. And I just think to myself, as I'm listening to you talking about how you're passionate about creation and young earth creationism and how God has used you to open the eyes and even pique the interest of scientists who normally wouldn't probably give you the time of day simply because he's led you to research something that needed to be researched, and he wanted to work through that. And I think about how important apologetics is and how important, like, I wonder how did you get through unscathed? I mean, you're serving the Lord, you're honoring him, and your work is groundbreaking, and but yet honoring of God, but you're respected by your colleagues and your peers who don't even agree with you religiously. Is it hard for you in the scientific community to be able to have a voice, and has it been difficult for you from time to time? Or I guess I don't know how that would be. That I would find that daunting.
In terms of what's going on now or in the last 15 years as a professional creationist, once you come out as one, you're basically cut off from the scientific community. And so
Sure.
there's a bit of working in isolation in terms of, and there's a qualification to that. What I mean is, in terms of going to meetings and rubbing shoulders with other scientists who are mainstream, I don't even try because I'm like, that's kind of like the plague. They
Yeah.
don't have anything to do with you. They know their careers will get canceled if they show any sort of sympathy towards it. So the main type of interaction, in a sense, if you can call it that, is I'm still reading their literature. I'm
Yes.
following the data that they publish. And so I'm keeping up with it and, in a sense, engaging from a distance because they've put us at arm's length or farther
Yeah.
outside the mainstream community and the general public. So I guess I've just come to accept that's how things operate, and that to really change things, you have to change the educational system.
Yeah.
In terms of getting to where I am or to where I was to start as a professional creationist, yes, the undergraduate and graduate levels were secular schools, but the key training, I think, ahead of time was homeschool through 8th grade, small Christian high school locally in Wisconsin that I went to. My parents picked it specifically because they were one of the few schools that would I guess affirm their teaching of young earth creation. The other
Yeah.
schools, I think, waffled somewhat or just were non-committal. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but one of the key pieces of advice that I read kind of after the fact, and I have a sister who's 16 years younger. I think when she was about to go off to college, I sent her this article that had this advice that I thought was apropos. Marvin Olasky, who used to be at World Magazine and taught at UT Austin, bastion of liberalism. I think he was in journalism, but his advice applied to all disciplines. He said, if you're going to go off to secular college, my advice is expect to hear nothing but the secular worldview in class, any discipline you go into, journalism, science, whatever. And if you want to learn the biblical worldview, you have to read just as much outside of class as in it, which, of course, if you're taking 16 credit hours full
It
time or
doubles.
more, who has time for that? And so this is not disagreeing with his advice. I agree with it. But then you say, how do you work that out practically? I think practically it's much easier if you get that extra reading ahead of time. And being homeschooled and having gone to worldview conferences, a very active, proactive, let's get grounded in this before I go off to college, was hugely beneficial for me so that there was nothing surprising in class. I guess it helps. Evolution really hasn't changed its arguments in 150 years.
No.
Yes, they use genetics, but it's the same
It's basically
form
the
of the
same.
argument
Yeah.
as Darwin. So there really aren't any surprises in evolution either
There's
in
nothing
that
new.
sense. Yes, that was a key factor, and what I tell parents with kids who are going off to school, I'm like, you have to get them grounded ahead of time. When I
Mhm.
first came to AIG, I thought we should get some sort of courses for them. It turns out we already have them. We've got 6 online courses, uh, some of each of the major disciplines like astronomy. Again, it's for, I think, high school level or so.
Yeah.
So this is not intense college level classes, but it's basic worldview training. There's biblical worldview training. Wait, 6 classes. I'm like, you can do 2 in the summer between freshman and sophomore, 2 between sophomore and junior, and so on. You can get all that knocked out
Yeah.
all online. I don't think the cost is great. The spiritual cost of not doing preparation, and it doesn't have to be those classes. It's just I was very excited to see AIG
Yeah.
had these. That's, I think, essential for any student to survive in that sort of pressure-packed environment. And it's got even, so much worse than when I was there.
Yeah.
And that's not, and again, this is only 15 years ago, how much college has changed.
Yeah.
That was critical. That's, I guess, that was a lot to say, but that's one category of factor that was critical for me growing up and getting to become a professional creationist, surviving college. Secondly, would be have a very strong local church network. So I went to church in Boston. Boston's a college town, but we had a very uh, intimate, sounds like a strange word, but a great group of college buddies I had to hold each other accountable, just
Mhm.
very spiritually sensitive, interested in the things of the Lord, interested in living for him, surviving. So that was hugely beneficial for me as well. And then I'd say the third factor would be just the prayers of people back home in Wisconsin. So I came from a good church. People continued to pray for me. I could ask questions of them. I remember one guy who taught Sunday school for 50 years, I think, uh,
Wow.
walking Bible essentially. Had some ethical issues I had to deal with in college. So I was working on stem cells, and of course, there's the embryonic stem cell issue, but there was a
Yeah.
separate issue dealing with biology and what cell lines to use. And anyway, just to be able to email him and say, hey, here's what I'm confronting. Can you help me walk through the step-by-step decision making on this? So all these were critical to getting through. And I mean, I think I've known for a long time, you come out as a creationist, you'll get marginalized. So I
Yeah.
didn't expect anything different going into it, but that doesn't stop, of course, my ambition from trying to change that. I feel like that's why AIG exists in part.
Yeah.
Yes, I think the main goal of AIG is church reform, but I think all of us also want to see the culture be reformed and changed so that the statistics are reversed and 99% of PhDs are not evolutionists, but creationists. 99% of students go off to colleges where they hear only creation.
Yeah.
I mean, I say only creation. I grew up learning creation evolution my whole life. I feel like
Yeah.
that's good preparation for if you're going to survive in a hostile environment. You have to know what they're going to say. You have to know what the other side is going to say, and you're prepared for it. And I could make their argument for them and then pick
Yeah.
it apart. So all this was essential to getting through.
Yeah. I would say that they just, as creationists, you welcome discourse because you follow the science. And science is meant to be questioned and tested and reproven or improved because something new came up and we didn't know what this was and now we do. And wow, that changes genetics or it changes biology or I mean all the things. And you think about how now they just shut down any questioning of science. And it's like, but then you're not teaching science, you're teaching basically a religion. So it's interesting to me. I would like to know, we talked, we've been kind of talking through this, but your book, the biblical significance, we've been talking a lot. God has just kind of led our podcast into discipleship of our kids. Like there's never been a more important time to get your kids so firmly planted in the word of God from kindergarten through 12th grade and your family to be rooted in the things of Christ and to understand the word and to understand how to give an answer, be ready to give an answer for anybody who asks. How does your book help with that when it comes to things like genetics, like DNA, like biology, like history? It touches so many subjects, this book. It isn't just a scientific book, it's a history book. There's a lot to it. And so can you talk and geography even, can you talk a little bit about the biblical significance of why this book is and books like this are just so important for our kids
Yes,
to learn?
and I'll a couple thoughts come to mind. One is even backing up to the evangelistic side, and then in the discipleship side,
Yeah.
there's an educational academic element to it. There's an apologetic side. So let's see if I can hit all 3 of those. Each of my books that I do, this one, they had names, Traced, Replacing Darwin. All these, I don't know, maybe because I can't help myself, always have some sort of gospel presentation. I think because I wrote these books in a sense for myself, wishing it was a book I had when I was in school to hand to a classmate and say, you have to read this. Whatever you think, you need to read this. And so there is this evangelistic use of these as well. I designed them not just to educate the reader, but to equip the church to be able to give away as evangelistic tools. In terms of discipleship, I was tickled you recommended that high school students read it.
Oh,
I've
yeah.
been racking my brain for a while about how do we turn this into curriculum. Part of the challenge, of course, is the normal high school curriculum is full. So for me, I had, I think, a year of geography, a year of world history, a year of U.S. history, a year of civics and government. And so if you put something in, you kind of have to take something out, and that's a tough choice. But I feel like there's something here where, we never learned the pre-European history of the Americas, but this is, if I was born and raised here, this is my home. I'd like to know what happened in my home
Yeah.
before Europeans got here. And so if there's some way to incorporate that, I'm still chewing on the best way to do it. Yes, at a minimum, the book is a place to start. There's videos we've done online where I think, and homeschooling has freedom, of course, to kind of
Yeah.
develop curriculum and pick and choose as you wish. So
We
I'm,
get to
I'm glad about
decide.
that. Yes. And in terms of the apologetics, I've got another booklet, I guess you could say, coming out hopefully by December or early next year called A New Way to Win. And this book, I would say, represents a new way to win this debate. And what I talk about specifically is, again, if you look at the history, we've done a lot of, I'd say, very good lawyer work. I'm affirming this and endorsing this as we've exposed the shortcomings of evolution. I was just thinking recently about, I watched an old, I think it was an Institute for Creation Research video on the origin of life. I don't remember who the presenter was, but he was respectful, but his case was just so devastating. He's like, all you need to do to evolve life from non-life is these 15 things. Hard to talk about even without laughing. And this is not to mock them as much as he just was presenting it as like, you just need the right conditions, or the right chemicals in the right place at the right time, the right conditions, the right concentrations. And by the time he gets to point 4 or whatever, you're like, this is ridiculous and impossible. It's never going to happen. And it's persuasive. It's very effective, which is, I wonder if that may have been part of the reason the courts essentially outlawed it, because it was too effective. And they said in the 1980s, if creationists want to have a place at the scientific table, they must make these testable predictions. Or another way to say it is they need to do detective work. That's been the focus the past 15 years for me. Again, this is not dismissing the lawyer work. It's in addition to that. So
Yeah.
building on that and saying, yes, there's been a very strong, basically airtight case against evolution. And it's not even just creationists, even the intelligent design community, like Michael Behe, his book, Darwin's Black Box, that's 20 years old or more, and no one's refuted it. They can't, because it's a impossible problem. He goes through the impossible problems for evolution to solve. But to have the basis to reverse these court decisions, which would have massive ramifications, again, for the culture. Right now, 99% of college students go to schools only hear evolution, and it's because of these court decisions. And I should say this too, just to finish that thought. We could ask the question, and I am asked that question by secular journalists. They love to use it as a type of gotcha. They
Yeah.
say, if 99% of, how do you explain that the fact that 99% of PhDs are evolutionists? And they want me to say either that there's some vast conspiracy, which they think sounds foolish, or that I just reject science, which also sounds foolish. The third explanation is they're of that profession because that's all they're ever taught. And I can make that case statistically now, where 99% of students are only taught this. Big surprise, 99% of scientists end up that way, which implies if you want to change those numbers, if you want to change the culture, and I've thought about this more and more now as a parent, I'm like, that's kind of I feel like the Bible takes this for granted. If Jesus is talking about prayer, I think it was, or I forget the exact context, but if your son asks you for a fish, would you give him a stone? Or if he asks you for bread, would you give him whatever it is? I'm probably butchering the quote, but the point being, it's just a fact of life that parents seek the best for their children. I grew up in a certain cultural context. The culture, of course, is going to pot now. Do I want my kids to grow up in that? No. A Christian society is better, and it's the product of education. That's what I'm getting at, is ultimately our society is determined by education. I can make that case with numbers. I can make that case for my opponents. Why did my opponents fight tooth and nail to kick creation science out of the schools? Just to kind of give the context for that. I'm waxing eloquent here, but I'm obviously passionate about this, because this is a really big deal for the wider cultural context.
Yeah. Keep
Homeschool
talking.
is a great way to avoid that fate, for one. And then if you think, to how do we then change the culture so that we don't have to even fight this, because we're fighting it because the educational system is this way. If you think about it, the evolutionists didn't fight to keep evolution in the schools. They were in the schools already.
Yeah.
It's just they added creation science to it, a fairly innocuous, vanilla, skim milk type request of, can we also have them be exposed to this? No, my opponent said. What's their big fear? They believe more than I do that what students are taught is how they're going to end up. That's why they fight tooth and nail. That's why they did fight tooth and nail to keep it out. That's why they continue to try to marginalize us, because they know if students are exposed to this, they will probably change their mind.
Because it makes
And so,
sense.
yes, yes. And so this book represents that sort of detective work.
Yeah.
Creationists going out, solving questions, positive, making discoveries, which completely erodes the legal basis for those 1980s court decisions. And so if someone wanted to relitigate all this, they could, because we have the basis to do so. Even apart from that, again, I think there's this natural cause and effect. Once you start making discoveries, like this book does, especially in arenas where there's essentially a cold case for evolution, they don't have great answers. They couldn't tell you what was the greatest battle, who was there, who fought. They don't have the tools to do so. We can come along with a scriptural framework and find these answers. Now people sit up and pay attention. And even if they're not taught it in school, there is a bit more of this democratization of communication with YouTube and such, and they hear about it. Oh no, they're exposed to it,
Oh.
according to the evolutionist. And that has potential as well for cultural change. So there's huge opportunities now, even though we don't have $45 billion annually from the NIH in terms of research monies, still in the providence of God with what our donors have supplied. And I think, again, because the Bible's true, it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. We've been able to make these discoveries, and this has really big ramifications for winning. This is the new way to win via this research and making predictions, fulfilling them, making discoveries that make news. There's a tremendous potential here. It's a new era in the creation evolution debate, and that's how the book fits into that.
That's so good. So wrapping it up, what are the biggest remaining mysteries in this type of history?
If you look at the book, the main play-by-play that I'm able to go through is that 8900s onward. So if you think about, if you put Babel about, 4,000, 4,500 years ago, there's still the vast majority of the history that we have yet to uncover, which is, why write a book? I addressed that in the beginning saying,
Yeah,
yes, there's a long way to go, but hey, I think what we learned so far is revolutionary and worth saying. So here's a starting point. And it provides a platform for the next generation of homeschoolers or others to build on that and find these discoveries. Again, even since the book came out, we've been able to solve one of the biggest mysteries, which was, what about these earlier so the book only takes us back genetically, basically, to the AD 300s or so.
Right.
I can go back archaeologically further, but there was this mystery of who did these earlier peoples come from. With genetics, I've been able to fill some of that in. That was a great relief for me. Yeah. One of the main counter arguments that I could think of for what I've been saying being true. We were able to solve that. But there's a lot of detail, a lot of play-by-play still to be filled in. I'm hoping we can eventually start connecting more tribes to specific branches of the family tree and do exactly that. Okay, your people go back here. We have them connected to this people over here at this point. And oh, look, there's an archaeological site that matches that. So there's a tremendous amount still to be worked out. There's still a lot of mystery, which is, of course, I think is exciting and fun. But what we have in this book far exceeds anything the evolutionists could give us. And just for me personally, is way more than, again, the blank slate I grew up with. That's no knock against my education. It's just nobody grows up with this. Yeah. Just as a side note, I was in the Amazon recently because we're looking at potential projects there. I asked a guy who was Indigenous and working for the government. He worked as an Indigenista, sort of surveying or I guess, oversight for some of the reserves, the reservations down there, healthcare, and so on. So what did you learn about your own people growing up in school? Nothing before the Columbus.
Isn't that sad?
Came from Paraguay, let's say, but that's it. So this is not a homeschool problem. This is a hemisphere-wide problem that the creationists, probably thanks as well to homeschooling, ultimately, which is how I grew up, are able to solve. And that holds the greatest potential to keep solving this mystery.
If there was ever a good apologetic argument about homeschooling, this would be it to me, is that you can allow your children to question and search and research and find, because the point of education is not to teach them information. It's to teach them to learn. It's to teach them to research. It's to teach them to be able to disseminate whatever it is that they're researching and put it into facts and papers and things. And this lets parents off the hook a little bit. Like, you can't teach your child everything. You're going to miss stuff, but you can teach them to be good detectives, like Dr. Jeanson said. And that's what he did with this book. They had names. I'm going to show it to you guys again. For real, get it, use it in your history class, in your science. It'll cover it's like a unit study, y'all. Just use it in your science and history and geography and all the things. in high school, and you can start them like in ninth, 10th grade. It'll challenge everything, but it'll also get them their mind going like, well, what is missing? Why don't we know about this? And you don't know what God's going to do with that. And I think if there was ever a good argument also for teaching our kids about apologetics and understanding what we believe and why we believe it, this is also a good reason to do it. With recent events, we're taping this, we're recording this about a week after Charlie Kirk's death. And, if there was ever a person who embodied why opening conversation up into just talking with people, but knowing what it is that you believe and being able to say it, that's a good reason for us to be educating our kids at home. And any last words you want to say to the parents that are listening?
I'd say, speaking as a PhD, what is it like to be a PhD? When you get to the PhD level, where you're giving the instruction to reach the PhD level is to reach the level of where you're supposed to be able to teach yourself, which I'm like, that's the basic lesson of homeschool.
Yes.
Yes, you have a parent and people, what about the classroom, this sort of thing? I'm like, you're teaching them what they're ultimately supposed to be able to do as PhDs, is to be able
Yeah.
to teach themselves, learn from a textbook, open it. That's what being an academic with a terminal degree is supposed to be, is you're supposed to be able to go out and find things and educate yourself on your own and make discoveries. And I feel like homeschooling gives you a leg up on everyone else because that's
Absolutely.
that's part of it. And we've got 4
Yes.
kids, and so how can mom pay attention to all of them? I'm like, well, that's part of the point, is they have to be able to learn and read on their own, and that's
Oh,
a life skill, an academic skill that will serve them in spades in the future. So I can't recommend it enough as a means of education.
yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I love it when we have you on. This is only the second time, but I love having you on because I always learn so much from you. And it always makes me think about like, okay, I need to do better at understanding this because, living where you live, you don't know what God's going to, what people he's going to put in your way. And to be able to encourage them, but also to have an answer for them is really important. And it always gets me like, I got to get better at this. So I appreciate you so much, Dr. Jeanson. Thank you so much. And everything that we talked about, of course, will be in the description of this podcast. You guys can find your links there for me. Answers in Genesis to other Dr. Jeanson's books. Plus, of course, they had names. I just encourage you guys, check it out. Get your kids involved in it. Make it something you do together because I promise you, you will learn something. It will challenge you. And I know growing up, going to school where I went to school too, I mean, we didn't cover any of this. And it's just something that has been just a glaring, omission from American history. And it's super important that we understand it. So, God bless you guys. Thanks so much for being a part of our podcast today. Come back and we'll try again another day with another guest. And just again, thank you so much, Dr. Jeanson, for being here.
Thank you.